Something strange began to happen within the hallowed walls of the royal palace, something that at first seemed like a mere ripple in the royal tapestry, but soon grew into a wave that no one could ignore. Staff who had once proudly spoken of Prince Louis with affection, discussing his mischievous nature and playful energy, now exchanged uneasy glances whenever his name was brought up. The familiar, jovial references to the youngest prince, once so common in private conversations and formal meetings, began to disappear entirely. What began with his subtle absence from ceremonial briefings escalated quickly. Louis's name was no longer mentioned in the agendas, no longer part of the discussions for royal appearances or engagements. His once solid presence in the royal schedule, his bright face and youthful enthusiasm, was now conspicuously absent from the planning documents. The changes were so calculated, so deliberate, that they went unnoticed at first, but soon the shift became undeniable. Louis's name, once a part of royal narratives alongside his siblings, was now being quietly erased. Not just from public appearances, but from official records, from future royal plans, from the very fabric of what was supposed to be a family united by blood, heritage, and destiny. It wasn't an accidental oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, one that grew more apparent with each passing day. The absence was too sharp, too deliberate, and as the days went on, it became clear that no one was allowed to ask why. Longtime aides, who had been loyal servants of the crown for decades, now appeared increasingly uncomfortable when his name was brought up. The air in the royal corridors grew thick with tension as those closest to the royal planning rooms grew quiet. When questioned directly about Louis, their responses were curt, cold. "We're not discussing that," they would say, with a sense of finality that sent shivers down the spine. "You'll have to refer to someone else," they'd add, usually without looking you in the eye. But the truth was, no one knew whom to refer you to. No one wanted to speak on the matter at all. The quiet erasure of Louis from public life became the palace's worst-kept secret. The public-facing royal publications, which had once celebrated the unity of William and Catherine's children, suddenly began to focus almost exclusively on George and Charlotte. Louis's role, once so clearly defined as an important part of the royal family's narrative, began to shrink into the shadows, fading as his siblings took center stage. In what could only be described as an attempt to rewrite history, an updated version of the family legacy document was released to the inner circles. Louis, once mentioned prominently alongside his brother and sister, had been entirely omitted from any discussions about future engagements or responsibilities within the monarchy. The delicate narrative that had once presented a picture of unity, a royal family of 3 children working in harmony for the kingdom's future, now leaned awkwardly to one side. Louis, once front and center, was gone. His name was absent, as though it had never been there at all. His role in the monarchy's future, his place in the lineage, was simply erased. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating behind closed doors. The air around the palace grew thick with uncertainty. A senior staffer, tired of holding their tongue, reportedly slipped a cryptic comment to a journalist during an off-the-record conversation. "There's been a decision, though no one's saying it out loud." When pressed further for details, the staffer, clearly shaken, only repeated the phrase, now heavier with gravity. "Something serious." It was said in hushed tones, and as soon as the words left their lips, the topic was quickly changed. A few days later, another royal insider, someone whose loyalty had never been questioned, was heard to remark ominously, "You'll understand when it's all over." The phrase struck fear into the hearts of those who overheard it. Something was happening within the palace. And the stakes were far higher than anyone had first realized. But it wasn't just the staff that noticed. The silence, which had begun as a subtle change in the palace's public-facing documents, began to seep into the royal family itself. Tensions simmered behind the palace walls. King Charles, who had always been known for his stoic calm and measured decisions, was reported to be holding frequent, secretive meetings with his most trusted advisors. Prince William, usually a steady force in the family, was often seen leaving these meetings with a stormy expression, his face a mask of frustration, confusion, and sorrow. The heated disagreements that arose during these secret sessions weren't just about royal affairs. They were about something far more personal. Some reports even claimed that William had tried to intervene, to push back against the growing trend to erase Louis from the family's future. But time and again, his pleas were met with resistance. Resistance from those who believed they knew better. Resistance from those who seemed determined to follow an alternative course, one that left Louis out of the equation entirely. Outside the royal bubble, the public remained blissfully unaware. The media continued to focus on the more visible aspects of royal life: George's growing stature, Charlotte's developing grace, and the charming family moments captured on camera. The monarchy, it seemed, had mastered the art of public relations, painting an image of perfect unity and poised perfection. But inside the palace, behind the curtains and layers of royal tradition, a quiet crisis had taken root. And at the center of it all was a young child, a boy whose future had been quietly swept away, cast into the shadows of his own family without so much as a word of explanation. The precision with which Louis was being erased was too clean, too calculated to be a mere oversight or a series of coincidental events. It was a deliberate move. Every trace of Prince Louis from the monarchy's internal projections had been wiped away, as though his entire existence was nothing more than an inconvenience to a carefully orchestrated plan. It wasn't just that he was being left out of state functions or future royal responsibilities. His very presence, his very future, was being erased from the narrative of the monarchy. It was as if the royal future had been rewritten to exclude him altogether. But why? Why had this decision been made? And who was truly behind it? These were the questions that plagued the minds of those who had been privy to the quiet shifts taking place. The answers were unclear, shrouded in secrecy, and deliberately kept from those who might have fought to protect the young prince's place in the family. As the tension mounted, the whispers grew louder, and the once sturdy structure of the royal family began to tremble under the weight of its own secrets. And then came the revelation, a piece of information so shocking that it threatened to unravel everything. A confidential memorandum, hidden deep within the royal archives, surfaced. This document, once sealed and locked away, revealed the true reasoning behind the strange series of decisions that had led to Louis's erasure from the royal family's future. When a senior aide finally managed to gain access to it, what they found sent shockwaves through the palace. The document outlined a series of strategic decisions made by King Charles, Prince William, and Queen Camilla regarding the royal children's roles in the monarchy's future. At first, it seemed like any other routine review of royal succession planning. But when the aide reached the section dedicated to Prince Louis, they stopped in their tracks. Louis's name wasn't listed under any of the projected royal responsibilities. Not a single word was written next to his name. The space where he should have been listed was simply blank. It wasn't that he had been removed from future engagements. It was that he had been erased entirely from the future of the monarchy. The realization was chilling. When William saw the document, the source close to him described the scene. He stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the page. The aide reported that William was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he processed what had been done. One source claimed he left the room without a word, pale and stiff. Another recalled that he muttered only one sentence. How could this happen? At that moment, everything changed. The palace that had once been a fortress of tradition and stability now seemed like a house of cards, its foundations cracking under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. The decision to erase Louis was no longer a behind-the-scenes matter. It was a crisis in the making. And as the pieces began to fall into place, the most pressing question of all remained. How far would the monarchy go to protect its image, and at what cost? And ultimately, would the silence surrounding Louis's erasure ever be broken? The Royal Communications Office, ever the stalwart guardian of the monarchy's image, refused to comment on the growing crisis. But behind closed doors, silence began to give way to something colder, more palpable. The once ironclad bond between Prince William and King Charles, who had stood side by side in the public eye on nearly every matter of royal policy, began to crack. Where once there had been unity, there now grew an undeniable rift. They began to avoid each other in private meetings, exchanging few words, and only when absolutely necessary. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Reports of shouting behind the palace's locked doors filtered through the ranks of staff, quiet at first but soon impossible to ignore. The aides, ever trained in their duties, tried their best to act as though nothing had changed. But the cracks were showing and they could no lun. Be concealed. Whispers filled the halls. The royal family, once the epitome of control and unity, was unraveling from within. The document, which had marked the beginning of Prince Louis's erasure from the royal narrative, was no longer just a bureaucratic decision. It was a symbol, a harbinger of something far more ominous. This wasn't just about Louis's absence. It was about something more profound, a deliberate pivot in how the monarchy would operate in the future. A decision was being made, not just about Louis, but about the very structure of the family itself. For those paying attention, it became clear that Louis wasn't being overlooked. He wasn't being sidelined because of some administrative error. He was being removed, erased from a future that had once seemed so certain, not just by decree, but by something deeper, more insidious. His presence was becoming a liability, and the powers that be were intent on removing him from the equation entirely. But the story of Louis's removal went far beyond the cold ink of official documents. It was tied to a moment, one tragic private night that would forever change the course of his future. The incident was buried in royal silence, locked away as tightly as the doors that kept the press from prying into the palace's inner workings. No cameras, no statements, no official record of what transpired. But within the palace walls, that night would become infamous, an event that, to those who witnessed it, was unforgettable. The evening had begun like so many others, a quiet, intimate dinner for the royal family away from the prying eyes of the press. The atmosphere was relaxed at first, a rare chance for the family to enjoy some semblance of normalcy, but something in the air shifted. A silence fell, too heavy, too sudden, and then came the outburst. It came from Prince Louis, only a child, but his behavior was nothing short of shocking. His scream tore through the room, jagged and panicked, a sound that seemed to freeze the blood of everyone present. There was the shattering of glass, something fragile, something symbolic, breaking in a way that no one could undo. No one moved at first. Even Catherine, who had always remained composed and poised, was stunned into silence. Louis's face contorted with something no one could understand. His expression was a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else entirely. William, desperate to regain control of the situation, was the first to react. He rushed to his son, trying to calm him, to soothe the outburst that had disrupted the quiet tension of the evening. But it was already too late. The damage was done. The atmosphere in the room collapsed. The air that had once been filled with the comfort of family now hung heavy with something much darker. The room emptied quickly. Some say Charles left without a word, his face unreadable, the weight of the moment too heavy for him to bear. Camilla, who had witnessed it all, was said to have muttered under her breath, "Not again." What did that mean? Was there a history to this kind of outburst, something from Louis's past that none of the public knew? That too would remain a mystery, buried beneath layers of palace protocol and royal secrecy. By morning, the palace had already shifted into crisis mode. No press statements were issued. No calls were made to the public. But behind the scenes, things moved quickly. Medical personnel were brought in under the strictest confidentiality. Their visit was never logged in official records. Their arrival was recorded only by internal surveillance cameras, and that footage was wiped clean within hours. Louis's disappearance from a scheduled event that same week was the first sign that something was seriously amiss. At first, it was chalked up as a simple scheduling issue, a misunderstanding. But soon it became clear that something much more deliberate was happening. Louis, once a staple in the royal family's public appearances, was slipping further and further out of view. A pattern emerged. His public appearances dwindled until they became almost non-existent. When he did appear, something was different. His smile, once bright and spontaneous, seemed distant, rehearsed, an empty shadow of the Louis his family had known. It wasn't just the public who noticed. Inside the palace, staff began referring to the evening of the outburst as the break. It was a fracture, not just in Louis, but in the very structure of the royal family. It wasn't just a personal crisis for the youngest prince. It felt like a crisis for the monarchy itself. No one was allowed to speak of it officially. The incident, the outburst, the medical visit, it all became part of a silent, unspoken reality. But those who worked inside the palace understood that it loomed over every decision that followed. It shaped every conversation, every directive, every shift in the royal schedule. It was impossible to ignore. Catherine, who had always been the calm, steady presence in the family, was visibly shaken in the days that followed. Her usual grace faltered. She was seen in private conversations with her closest aides, her face tight with worry. William, too, withdrew. He stopped attending internal briefings for almost a week, retreating into himself, consumed by the weight of what had transpired. The monarchy, so accustomed to controlling its own narrative, now found itself scrambling behind the scenes to understand what had just happened, and more importantly, how to contain it. But the question that hung in the air unspoken was this: what had truly changed? Yes, Louis had changed. Something had snapped inside him, something no one could fully explain. But beyond that, something had shifted in the royal family's willingness to continue including him in their plans. The monarchy, once a carefully constructed image of unity and tradition, had just witnessed the breaking of one of its own. And now the decision was being made not by decree, but by something deeper, something rooted in fear. The fear of what Louis's future might hold, the fear of what might happen if he continued to disrupt the delicate balance of royal expectations. It wasn't just about his actions. It was about how those actions had exposed the cracks in the royal family's facade. What was once an institution built on control and stability was now facing an uncertain future, one that had been irrevocably altered by the events of that night. And as the weeks passed, the question remained: would the monarchy ever truly recover from the fracture that had been caused by one child's outburst? Would they find a way to reintegrate Louis into the family, or would he be cast aside, never to be seen again? The answer, it seemed, lay in the silent, chilling decision that had been made behind closed doors, the decision to remove Louis from the royal narrative entirely. And the family, once united, would never be the same again. So much weight, and I can't do this for her anymore. Catherine, the steadfast mother, had always been a source of strength for her children, but the pressure was now wearing her thin. The quiet removal of Louis from public life was a secret none of them could speak of, but the emotional toll it was taking on Charlotte was becoming impossible to ignore. In the midst of a family crisis that was carefully hidden from the world, Charlotte, who had once been the epitome of grace and composure, was unraveling in ways that no one, not even her closest allies, could have predicted. The weight of the secret was not just a burden on Charlotte, but on the entire family. As the monarchy navigated its public persona, Catherine and William were increasingly forced to focus on maintaining their carefully crafted image, which only deepened the isolation Charlotte felt. She was a child caught between two worlds, the royal expectations of poise and composure, and the deeply human anguish of witnessing her brother's gradual erasure from everything that defined their family's legacy. But Charlotte's struggle didn't end with her emotional turmoil. The more she internalized the absence of Louis, the more isolated she became from those around her. Friends who once relied on her steady influence began noticing her withdrawal, her lack of enthusiasm for events she used to look forward to. Even in moments of supposed joy, Charlotte's eyes no longer sparkled with the same light they once did. The grace that had made her the darling of the press seemed now to be a facade, something she struggled to maintain even as her inner world fractured. The palace tried to protect its own. Charlotte's behavior was written off as growing pains, a phase any child might go through. But those closest to her knew better. It wasn't just adolescence. It wasn't just a shift in mood. Charlotte was grieving not just the loss of her brother's presence in her life, but the loss of an entire future that had been meticulously mapped out for her. The monarchy was a machine that left little room for personal trauma, especially when it could threaten the public-facing image of perfection. And so Charlotte's struggle was hidden behind the carefully constructed walls of royal secrecy. In private conversations with Catherine, those who were close to the family saw a mother desperate to shield her daughter from the deepening emotional scars. But Catherine's own heart was breaking. She saw the pain Charlotte was carrying, the silent way in which her daughter had begun to change before her very eyes. Charlotte had always been her rock, a quiet strength beside her in times of difficulty. Now she was retreating into herself, haunted by the absence of her brother, by the choices made without her, and by the looming uncertainty that hung over them all. It wasn't long before the cracks in Charlotte's composure began to show during public appearances. The once radiant princess, the picture of royal perfection, now appeared distant, her smiles more rehearsed, her posture stiff and formal. The people who adored her, who had once seen her as the future of the monarchy, now began to see something else, someone who was no longer quite as untouchable as they had once imagined. The facade that had been built so carefully over the years was beginning to fracture, and it was only a matter of time before the public would see what lay beneath. But Charlotte wasn't the only one affected. Prince George, too, was struggling with the weight of the changes around him. Though he remained largely composed in public, those close to the royal family saw that even he was beginning to feel the strain of a future that was being redefined without his younger brother. The bond between the siblings had always been strong, but as Louis's future was systematically erased, that connection seemed to weaken, leaving George feeling unmoored, unsure of where he fit in the shifting royal landscape. The family, once united in their duty to the crown, now found themselves pulled apart by a shared grief that could not be acknowledged. The royal advisors, who had once been so precise in their management of royal appearances and schedules, were now scrambling to manage the emotional fallout of a decision that no one had seen coming. Behind the polished smiles and public appearances, the royal family was beginning to crack under the pressure of their own carefully constructed image. In one particularly emotional moment, Catherine confided in an old friend, saying, "I don't know who we are anymore. The family I knew, the family I had hoped we would be, it's not the same anymore." And in that admission lay the heart of the crisis that was slowly tearing the family apart. The royal family, for all its power and tradition, was not immune to the deep personal toll of loss, of betrayal, and of a future rewritten without their consent. As Charlotte continued to withdraw, the palace's focus on Louis's absence only intensified. For the monarchy to survive, for the image to remain intact, the past had to be erased. Louis's name, once a fixture in the royal calendar, became a void that no one dared to fill. And as the royal family worked to protect themselves from public scrutiny, they grew more distant from each other. Louis was no longer part of the narrative, but neither were the emotions that came with his removal, emotions that ran deeper than anyone in the palace could have predicted. It was a tragedy not just for Louis, but for the entire family. The very system that was meant to protect them, both as individuals and as an institution, had ultimately become the force that tore them apart. The silences, the absence, the refusal to acknowledge the hurt, these were the true costs of the decision that had been made, and no one was immune to its effects. Charlotte, who had once been the bright light of the monarchy's future, now found herself trapped in the shadows of a family secret that would haunt them all.